We have come to the end of the course, and as is always the case with these spring and summer courses, they pass so quickly and they're so condensed. And I know many of you are feeling that. So I wanted to just wrap up at the end here with some final remarks and also to give you some indication of what to expect on the final exam and what I'm looking for in terms of the final exam. I'll also talk a little bit about how best to prepare yourself for it. So in my final remarks, I wanted to start looking in a more global way at all of these issues that we've raised in the course and ideas that have been presented. And I know you've all been participating on the discussion boards, which is great. And I know a lot of you work in healthcare. And even if you haven't, we've all dealt with healthcare and probably have certain ideas about it. So I want to start by engaging with what are some possible improvements, what are some changes that could potentially be made in the way that healthcare works in Canada and how we think about it. So I wanted to start out by looking at the individual level. Can we move beyond the metaphor of mind and body as machine? So as we talked about in the beginning of the course, I would argue that the majority of Canadians view their body in this way. So it's something that gets dinged and harmed, and then they take it to the mechanic and get it fixed. But there's often no idea about preventative measures or maintaining health or thinking a lot about that. So part of this, what comes out of this, is also the search for the magic bullet that we're going to somehow find a magical cure for various diseases. So can we move beyond that? Is there a way that we can start to do that? How can people cultivate a healthier life? So in as much as the power is in our hands to some extent, not completely, what do you think are things that would help to cultivate a healthier life for Canadians? Also, if you were to create a health plan for yourself, what would it look like? So in looking at all of these different approaches, all these different cultures, are there any ideas that you could draw on and bring into your own life, or do you think they would be useful within your own life? So I'm just wanted you to think about that. If you were to develop, or if you already have one, what is it? What do you need in life to keep all the aspects of life as understood in the model of the medicine wheel in balance? Physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. So this idea of a holistic way of looking at health, that it isn't just the body, and what are some of the suggested activities or attitudes that would help in these various quadrants of life, do you think? As I've talked about at various points in the course, addiction is a very good way of looking at some of these issues, because addiction shows very clearly that some of our biggest problems are not strictly physical. Obviously, addiction has a physical component, but we know that's not all of it, or not even most of it. And so what insights can we bring from the tradition studied in how we understand and treat addiction? And so what do you think these culturally inflected or religious and spiritual traditions can offer in this regard? Because obviously addiction is a huge and growing problem in countries like Canada. And if you're just looking purely practically, it's costing the government huge amounts of money. It also is causing enormous amounts of stress on family systems, as many of you will know. And a lot of our ER departments are taken up with dealing with these chronic cases of addiction. So this is just one example, but how could we potentially build on the insights that we've come across in this course? Should we be sending people, as the Irish and English National Health do, to monasteries like the one in Thailand, or should we also develop institutions such as these? Would it be possible? So we're always walking that line between the secular and the sacred. How do you, obviously the monastery in Thailand is explicitly Buddhist, and that wouldn't work in the Canadian healthcare system, which is secular. but could we bring some of these insights somehow into how we're dealing with addiction? So building on that question, can we draw on the various approaches to healing discussed in this course? And obviously we've looked at a wide variety of approaches, and they share certain things in common. For instance, an emphasis on a holistic approach to health that takes into account all these different domains of health. Also, as I mentioned in the first part of the course, a lot of the illnesses facing Canadians are what we would call lifestyle illnesses. So they're not brought about through, dirty water. They're not brought about necessarily through viruses. Obviously, the recent pandemic, that was the case. But in most cases, a lot of the chronic problems that Canadians are dealing with are actually much more related to diet and lifestyle. So how can we go about looking at that in a different way rather than simply treating the symptoms, which cost the healthcare system a huge amount of money? Can we improve the hospital experience so that it is patient-centered and no longer feels like moving into an alien culture? So we looked at that whole idea that for the vast majority of people, when they move into a hospital setting, it feels like a foreign country in a sense, with a different language, different way of dressing, and really often feeling like you're on your back foot. You don't know really what's going on, and you've given up a lot of your agency in that setting. So are there ways we can mitigate some of that? And this is already happening. I've noticed it in my lifetime. For instance, many, if not all, Canadian hospitals now allow family and friends to stay overnight. For instance, that wasn't the case when I was a kid. There were very strict visiting hours and you got kicked out. So I've noticed that hospitals are much more treating it as a system. So working with the family, working with the friends, instead of treating them like a problem that they're dealing with, using them as a resource to help the patient to heal. So that has definitely changed. I also have noticed, certainly in the new North Bay Hospital, the effort to bring nature in, to have nature accessible and visible through the windows, and also art. So I actually know the person who was called upon, he's a curator in the community, to bring art into the hospital. So do you think this helps? I know a number of you work in healthcare. I'd be very interested to know your thoughts on this. And also, has it worked, these improvements, in your opinion? So I wanted to end with some examples of where I think these changes are happening and have been implemented successfully, just so that we can start to envision what this would look like across the board. And one is the North Bay Parry Sound District Health Unit, which is very close to where I live, actually. And as it was being built, I was watching because I'm very curious about new architecture. And so I was very struck by the way that they built this and also the way the grounds are designed. And so it's pretty clear to me, I don't know this for a fact, but it's pretty clear to me whoever was designing it did this very carefully and took on board a lot of the critiques that have been made of healthcare spaces in Canada. And if we think about the reading in the course pack about healing therapeutic spaces, how does this express some of that? So one thing I noticed is the grounds are absolutely lovely, and you can kind of see it in the artistic rendering, but if you go by it, first of all, let me just say, very rarely, I think, do you feel like when you go by a place that's dedicated to healthcare in Canada, you feel like, I want to go in there and see what that looks like. But the minute I saw this building, it made me want to go inside. So very welcoming the way it's set up. Also, trees, flowers, plants all around the building. Lots of windows, so lots of natural light. And also the foyer where the reception desk is full of light. It's very open, it's very welcoming, and there's art throughout, and lots of wood and natural materials. So I think this is a good example of a very sort of a foundational pillar of health and healing in the North Bay community that didn't take just a utilitarian that I think the utilitarian model was very much in vogue from the 1950s until very recently in Canada. Very austere looking, sterile environments. So it was very encouraging for me to see that whoever designed this and they thought it through in terms of making people feel as comfortable as possible when they're and welcome in the space. Another example of how healthcare in Canada and certainly around the world has taken on board some of the critiques that have been made and has also allowed for ideas from spirituality to enter in is the Nipissing Serenity Hospice. And I've been quite involved with this hospice, and so I know a bit about it, but it's part of the larger philosophy of hospice, and I am teaching a course on hospice next term. So the original idea behind hospice, as some of you will know, was developed. It comes out of a long history of Christian ideas about death and dying, but the modern iteration of hospice is directly linked to Cicely Saunders, who is a British woman, very interesting woman, was a nurse, a social worker, and then became a medical doctor, and developed this model of hospice care, end-of-life care, that creates an atmosphere that's much more like a home and really treats death and dying as part of life and encapsulates it within family and culture and religion and so on. And so this is a good example, in my opinion, of how this would work, what this would look like in a secular place like Canada with all these different religious traditions. So the city, to its credit, gave Nipissing Hospice the land for, I think, $1, and it's in a beautiful, beautiful setting. If you've been there, you'll know what I mean. It's sort of abutting onto Laurier Wood, so there's a river that runs through. There's woods everywhere, so people can go sit out on the patio, or they can, if they're well enough, they can go down to the water. And so they took on board that idea, even though it is right in the city. It feels like it's in nature. So you can see in this picture of one of the rooms, the person is looking out onto nature. And in terms of the religious aspect, the larger idea within hospice is that the person who is dying has access to whatever they need. So in some hospices, there's a chapel or a sacred room, and so at Nipissing Serenity Hospice, they have what's called the sacred room. It's there for whatever the person, if they want to pray or meditate, or the family wants to go in and do that. There's also a space where you can sit in kind of a screened porch area. Also, religious clergy and elders are kind of on speed dial, so they can be contacted if people want to use their services or families want access to them. Also, the hospice was specifically developed to allow for smudging, so for traditional Indigenous practices to take place. So what I'm saying here is that I think the hospice is a very good example, not just the Nipissing one, but all the hospices that have developed in the world, have been able to take on board a lot of the concepts that we've talked about in this course. And I think one of the reasons is because the biomedical model doesn't really have a lot to say about death and dying. And so hospice was able to move into that space. And now there's a whole subset of teachings around palliative care for medical doctors and for nurses. And so in some ways, I think this is a model for the whole system and the way that these ideas could be brought in. Another potential for change and development within healthcare in Canada is the idea of the relationship between traditional forms of healing and biomedicine. And as I've been saying throughout the course, this requires a change of attitude on the part of many people, because for many, many people, biomedicine is the only legitimate approach to healing, and everything else is somehow a little bit strange and maybe what you do if you're absolutely desperate. So I think moving forward, there would need to be a big change in that attitude. And so And it is happening. We know statistically that well over 50% of Canadian and Americans now use a variety of approaches to health and healing. And as we have looked at throughout the course, it doesn't mean they don't use biomedicine. And if we think of all the examples given, whether it's dream healing or in the work of Maya Tawari, they all used biomedicine in terms of if they had a serious illness, but they were using other techniques as well, and then they went on to use them to stay healthy. So in a perfect world, what would be the relationship between traditional forms of healing and biomedicine? Where are the places where they could intersect? How could they intersect? Should OHIP cover alternative treatments? This is a bit of a dream of mine. OHIP used to cover chiropractors and then they got delisted, so I feel like we're actually moving in the opposite direction. Now that said, medical insurance companies often will cover these treatments, which I find fascinating because clearly the insurance companies know these are helpful modalities or they wouldn't cover them. So definitely we're seeing more and more in terms of private insurance that it will cover things like chiropractor or massage, etc. So is there a way these systems could interface in a more productive way? I think it's important to think about. At the moment, it's pretty siloed, but is there a way we could bring, for instance, alternative treatments into the hospital? I think this may be happening to some extent with kinesiology, which isn't really an alternative healthcare modality, but could we do that? Could we have massage available? Could we have chiropractors available? I'm going to end now by talking about the final exam. So the way it will be set up will be short and long answer, no point form ever. So it has to be in sentences, short essay form. And all the questions are open-ended. So what I'm trying to do here is see that you have done the readings, watched the lectures, and you understand them and you've reflected on them. So I'm giving you a lot of room to show me what you know. So people will often say, how long do you want the answer to be? I don't know. It depends on what you want to tell me. So it's completely up to you. You have a long time to work on it. It's a take home, quote unquote. So really I'm just trying to see that you have covered the material in the course pack, you've watched the videos, you've thought about it, and you've engaged with these questions. So the best way to study, as always, is to go through your notes, and I would highly recommend you go through all the material again and take notes. Note-taking is just a very good way to ingrain things in your memory. Make sure you have watched, read, and understood the material on Blackboard and in the course pack. So as in any course, you're expected to know the material that's assigned on the syllabus and be able to show me that you understand it. So I'm just going to review some of the central themes. This doesn't mean it's the only thing that's going to appear on the exam, but I want to sort of flag this as some of the central themes that you should be thinking about and considering as you're studying. So this was partly why I wanted the discussion boards to be active, because it's a way of getting you to engage these ideas as we're going along. So how do metaphors influence how we understand health and in turn treat our bodies and those of others? So that first exercise we did in asking you to think about how you imagine your own body, because that directly impacts how you're going to imagine health and how you're going to treat your body and the bodies of others. So thinking about what that means conceptually, if somebody understands their body in terms of a mechanical metaphor versus an organic metaphor, for instance. Number two, the million-dollar question, what is health? So we've talked a lot about this. So the idea of developing an idea of what you think health is and drawing on these different ideas, including the WHO definition or others. A number of you have your own definitions based in your professions. Is there a difference between healing and curing? So this is one of the concepts that flows throughout the course. I focused on it in the section on Jewish healing, but really it's throughout the course. What is the difference between healing and curing? Within our current model, we tend to think there's only curing. Number four, why do religious people on average tend to be healthier both mentally and physically? What approaches do they tend to share? So clearly, religions differ markedly in their theology and their attitudes. However, they share certain approaches that we can see within health and healing. Just for example, an emphasis on community, for instance. And we know that community and social relationships are very important to health, for both on a practical level, that if you have support, you have somebody to drive you to the hospital, very basic human support, but also psychologically, the way that support helps mentally and physically. So, as I made clear at the beginning, this doesn't mean that all religious people are healthy all the time, but we know from it's now definitive research that on average, religious people tend to be healthier both mentally and physically. So, why would that be? So I'm hoping now by the end of the course you'll see that it's pretty clear why that's the case, and whether or not you're religious or not, the reasons can be broken down quite clearly. So just to give one example, the idea that if I believe in God or a higher power or intelligence that's helping me and supporting me and is taking care of things in my life, that's going to ease a lot of the internal stress that I'm feeling, for instance. So we know that about people, regardless of what their religion or spirituality is. If they truly believe that, they're going to tend to be a lot less anxious, for instance. So that's just one example. But I want you to think about that and perhaps work it out on a piece of paper. Why do religious people on average tend to be healthier? Why do we see the idea across culture that working in healthcare is not simply a job? Where do we see this expressed? So the idea emerging right from shamanism, that the idea of being called to a vocation, that kind of language is found throughout healthcare, and it's not the only profession. There's a number of professions, I think, that have this. Sometimes people call it a missional approach. It's not just about money. It's not just a transactional activity, that it has a higher meaning. And so typically this will manifest, and we see this all the time. If we think of Doctors Without Borders, or I think there's Nurses Without Borders, or we think of the work that healthcare professionals do, often going far beyond the call of duty. Why do you think that is so important? And I used the example of Dr. Nancy Oliveri to illustrate this idea of the Hippocratic Oath, for instance, or the Oath of Maimonides, that many times in healthcare it's explicitly taught to the students that this is not just a job, it's not just a way to make money. 6, why are so-called alternative forms of healthcare gaining in popularity? So as I mentioned before, we know that increasing numbers of North Americans are using traditional Chinese medicine. They're going for massage, they're going to naturopaths, etc. So why do you think that is? Why do you think practices like meditation, yoga are so popular? And finally, how can we improve healthcare? In your opinion, what do you think are some ways that we could use some of the wisdom of these other approaches, and how can we improve healthcare?